Section 1. Hey guys, tonight we're settling into the soft dust and slow breezes of 12th century Mesopotamia. The heat isn't fierce here, it's lazy. The Tigris rolls by in no hurry. Somewhere in the distance, someone is quietly reciting poetry, and the smell of lentils drifts in from a clay kitchen. You're not a soldier, not tonight. You're just a quiet presence, tucked in a shadowed corner of a riverside house in a town called Tikrit. A baby has just been born. He's not loud. He doesn't scream. He just blinks up at the world with long, thoughtful pauses between breaths. His name is Yusuf ibn Ayyub, but you'll know him soon enough by the name the world remembers best, Saladin. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments. What's your location and local time right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wouldn't guess it yet, but this quiet child is going to change the entire face of the Middle East, not with fury, but with grace. Not by burning cities, but by protecting them. He'll lead armies, yes, but he'll also pause mid-campaign to write letters to his rivals, to send fruit baskets, to offer water to his prisoners. For now, though, he's just a baby in a cradle, born into a Kurdish family in exile. The family isn't poor. They aren't quite noble either. They're soldiers, more or less. Administrators, minor officers, just important enough to be noticed by the wrong people. His father, Ayyub, serves a local governor. His uncle Shirkuh? Well, he's a little louder, a little bloodier. But Saladin? He's a quiet one. As a boy, he prefers poetry to swordplay, books to battle. He memorizes verses, listens to long debates between men with beards and heavy eyebrows, and starts to ask questions like, what does it mean to be good? When most children are still figuring out how to catch frogs. He learns Arabic, of course, but also Persian, Turkish, and a bit of Latin just for the fun of it. You catch him once under a tree, writing calligraphy with a stick in the dirt, recreating battle formations that he read about in a book. Not because he wants to fight, but because he wants to understand. The adults watch him and murmur things like, too soft, and not a warrior. But his mother just smiles and hands him another date cake. Years pass quietly. He grows. Not tall at first, not broad, but steady, thoughtful. He doesn't argue much. He just listens, and then, hours later, asks one small question that silences a room. You travel with his family as they leave Tikrit. Life shifts to Mosul, to Syria, to places where the minarets lean differently and the water tastes like different stones. You walk alongside camels, hear the crunch of sandals over sand, and learn the rhythm of a young mind beginning to map the world. Saladin watches everything. Not with hunger, with intent. One night, at age 14, you find him reading by candlelight while everyone else sleeps. He's copying a quote from an old scholar. Something about justice being stronger than swords. He doesn't look up. He just murmurs, I think I'd like to try that. You smile, because you already know he will. Section 2. The desert doesn't whisper, it mutters softly, like an old man telling a story he's told 100 times. And if you listen carefully, somewhere between the rustle of palm trees and the dry creak of camel harnesses, you'll hear something else. The voice of a teenage Saladin reciting poetry to a donkey. You're in Baalbek now, a small but scholarly town with more books than soldiers, more pigeons than politics. And Saladin? He fits right in. He's 16. Quiet, observant, and already capable of making even the most long-winded scholars feel like their stories aren't quite long enough. He listens to jurists debate about theology for hours, then softly asks, but what happens when they both think they're right? The room goes silent. Someone drops a teacup. His days are long but deliberate. In the mornings, he studies the Quran, not just for memorization, but for meaning. Midday is for riding. He's not flashy on horseback, but he's precise, balanced, calm, like someone trying to make the animal feel safe, not submissive. Afternoons? Law, ethics, Tax code. A bit of geometry, though he thinks angles are less interesting than people. You once find him sketching out the shape of a mosque, not for architecture, but to ask how sound travels through prayer halls, and evenings are for poetry. He doesn't write much of his own. Not yet. But he copies lines he loves into a leather notebook. His favorite verse begins, "The sword may break a wall, but only the word builds a house." That's the thing about Saladin, he's always building something. In his head, at least. You meet his uncle, Shirkuh, for the first time around now. He's the opposite of Saladin, loud, broad, always 3 bites ahead at dinner. He tells stories of battle, of river crossings, of siege ladders and flaming tar. Saladin listens politely, then asks, what happened to the people who lived there? Shirkuh blinks, grunts. Some fled. Saladin nods. And the rest? You admire that he doesn't ask to be liked. He asks to know. Still, Shirkuh sees something in his quiet nephew. Too gentle, he mutters. But that can be sharpened. You spend days in libraries, nights in moonlit courtyards. Saladin trains, not with flashy swordplay, but with drills. Form. Repetition. You once catch him counting arrow fletchings out loud to study symmetry. He's not destined for battle yet. But battle is slowly bending toward him. One afternoon, the call comes. Shirkuh is marching south. To Egypt. Politics. Rebellion. A collapsing Fatimid caliphate. And Shirkuh wants Saladin to come, not as a warrior. As an aide. A clerk. A mind in the field. Saladin hesitates. He looks at his books. At the unfinished verse on his desk. At the quiet courtyard where birds still circle lazily overhead. Then he sighs, ties his notebook shut, and says softly, "All right. But I'd like to come back." You pack lightly. Just parchment. Ink. A spare robe, because history, it turns out, doesn't wait for you to finish reading. Sometimes, it comes knocking with a sword and an invitation. Section 3. You'd think an army on the move would be noisy, trumpets blaring, hooves pounding, soldiers shouting like vendors at a bazaar. But in truth, it's mostly the squeak of wooden wheels, the rustle of canvas, and the occasional deeply suspicious camel snort. You're with Saladin now, somewhere between Syria and Egypt, as he follows his uncle Shirkuh into a campaign that everyone describes as complicated, with a tone that suggests absolutely doomed. Saladin isn't thrilled. He's not a soldier. Not yet. He's the guy in the tent late at night, making lists of grain supplies and reorganizing the medical tents. He still carries a copy of poetry tucked in his satchel, right next to a well-used quill. You once watch him calculate the daily water allotment for the cavalry, using a system based on moon phases and historical rainfall. It almost works. The army is a patchwork of volunteers, mercenaries, and hardened veterans. They're here because the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt is tearing itself apart, and anyone, has to decide who gets to pick up the pieces. Shirkuh is all muscle and momentum. Saladin is the clipboard trailing behind. The ride south is long, hot, and unglamorous. But Egypt, when you arrive, feels like something out of a dream. The Nile, steady and calm. The palm trees, swaying without hurrying. Cairo itself, a riot of color and language and market stalls that spill into every alley like they're trying to escape organization. Shirkuh storms into politics like a bull in a silk shop. Saladin? He observes, watches, learns who talks too much, who listens too well. He maps alliances the way others map roads, quietly, in his mind. They win a few battles, occupy a few cities. Then Shirkuh, quite suddenly, dies. Some say poison. Others say food poisoning. Either way, not very poetic. And suddenly, Saladin is in charge. No royal blood. No loud victory speech. Just a quiet man with decent handwriting, suddenly holding the keys to the most powerful post in Egypt, vizier. Right-hand man to a caliph he doesn't quite agree with. Sunni vizier in a Shura court. He doesn't want it. Not really. He tries to refuse. Politely. Then firmly. Then awkwardly. But Cairo is tired of generals who break things. And so, almost by accident, Saladin becomes the leader of Egypt. He spends his first day reviewing tax records. His second inspecting aqueducts. His third asking why no one has repaired the grain storage towers. No coronation. No parades. Just a quiet start. A man who prefers books to blood, suddenly running a kingdom teetering between war, wealth, and religion. 18 night, in a garden that smells faintly of mint and dust, he kneels in prayer. You watch from the shadows, wondering whether this quiet boy who once wrote verses to the stars will survive this. But you already know he won't just survive. He'll change everything. Section 4. It's funny how power doesn't always arrive with a trumpet blast. Sometimes, it slips in through the back gate and quietly unpacks its bags. Saladin, just a few days into his reluctant post as Vizier of Egypt, still isn't quite sure what's happened. 1 week he's managing camel logistics and trying to avoid sunburn. The next he's the most powerful man in Cairo, second only to the Fatimid Caliph. A caliph who, frankly, isn't doing much besides reclining on cushions and watching history roll past like a lazy river. And Saladin? He does what anyone would do when unexpectedly handed a collapsing kingdom and a treasury shaped mostly like a sieve. He makes a to-do list. Item 1, don't get assassinated. Item 2, rebuild trust. Item 3, maybe start with the irrigation system. Actually, you spend your mornings with him now, pacing the wide stone halls of the vizier's palace, which still smells faintly of burnt sugar and old scrolls. He's reviewing budgets, not just in gold, but in grain, salt, water. You watch as he asks a tax collector why Cairo's southern quarter paid double last year. The man stammers. Saladin nods slowly and sends him back with instructions to try again, but this time, be kind. He's not flashy, but he is tireless. 18 night, he writes letters. Not to foreign kings, not yet, but to scholars, asking about education reforms. He orders hospitals restocked, markets regulated, and, controversially, starts taxing everyone just a little more equally. A few people grumble. A few vanish mysteriously. You don't ask that he's still Sunni, remember. And the Fatimid Caliphate is officially Sharia. A lesser man might crack the system open or flee. Saladin? He treads softly. He lets the old rituals continue, but nudges, very gently, the direction of the prayers that he replaces commanders, quietly, substitutes judges, subtly. And when someone finally realizes what he's doing, they try to stir rebellion in the name of the old ways. Saladin responds by inviting the dissenters to dinner. They show up, ready to debate. He serves them lamb with honey, listens to their concerns, and then walks them through a vision of a stable Egypt where people aren't afraid of tax collectors and water flows in the poor districts, too. They leave confused and convinced, and if they don't, well, the prisons stay mostly empty, but the library gets fuller. Something shifts in Cairo. The city begins to trust him, not because he declares himself worthy, but because he fixes the sewage in week 2 and the schools in week 5.1 evening. You sit beside him on a rooftop as the city glows under the desert stars. He's drinking a quiet tea, watching the minarets catch the last gold light. I didn't come here to rule, he murmurs. I just didn't want to leave it worse than I found it. You glance at the to-do list beside him, but it's longer now, but he's still writing. Section 5. Some leaders arrive on horseback, tossing coins to crowds and quoting ancient war songs. Others arrive like Saladin, with a spreadsheet, a not quite clean robe, and the quiet insistence that we really ought to rethink the tax exemptions for spice vendors. He's now officially Vizier of Egypt, and somehow, no one's panicking. That's the first sign something's different. He still refuses parades. He still refuses new robes unless the old ones are actually falling apart. He spends more time with engineers than generals, and most people in Cairo describe him with phrases like calm, organized, slightly obsessed with grain. And they're not wrong. Under Saladin's watch, irrigation canals are dredged. Storage silos get rebuilt. Markets are suddenly less chaotic, more predictable. You start seeing receipts, and perhaps most surprising of all, people stop bracing themselves every time a royal decree is announced. Because Saladin doesn't shout reforms from balconies. He posts them quietly. With explanations. One scroll, posted at the mosque gates, begins, so that no man may pay more because he is weak, and no man less because he is strong. And just like that, taxation becomes something almost reasonable. But even amid all this dusty reform, Saladin doesn't forget what's circling outside Egypt's fragile borders. The Crusaders are still in Jerusalem. Rumors float in from caravans and wandering monks. Stories of kings from Europe planning new campaigns, of knights sharpening swords, and raising holy banners again. But Saladin doesn't panic. He plans that he reorganizes the army. Yes, but not by recruiting more men. By training the ones he has. Infantry get real boots. Cavalry learn to ride together, not just fast. He splits soldiers into small, mobile units, gives commanders autonomy, and requires all of them to know at least some accounting. 1 General protests. Saladin gently suggests he start with addition. But even in the army, he's not ruling with fear that he starts attending drills. Quietly, observing from shade tents, asking questions like, do the men have enough water? Before asking about sword angles. And the men? They begin to speak of him differently. Not the vizier. Just him, the one who shows up, the one who listens, the one who knows that an army is only as strong as its camp cook and as stable as its quartermaster. By the end of the year, Cairo looks different, quieter, cleaner, calmer, like a city that knows someone has their hand gently, steadily on the wheel. And yet, Saladin still refuses a crown. I serve, he tells a merchant one morning, until God and the people tell me otherwise. You find him late that night in the courtyard again, rereading a letter from Damascus. War is brewing, and it's not the kind you can avoid with smart budgeting. That he sips his tea, the stars are quiet, and so is he. But you can already feel the tension gathering like a drawn bowstring. Because sooner or later, this man who fixes aqueducts is going to have to pick up a sword. Section 6. You've seen him in markets, in mosques, in muddy parade grounds beside weary horses. But now, you see Saladin somewhere new, between two worlds. Literally, he's standing at the edge of a prayer gathering in Cairo. Half the congregation Sunni, half Shiite, and all of them staring at him to see what happens next. The Fatimid Caliph, technically his boss, is still alive, but only just. A figurehead with a failing grip on power and a taste for poetry more than politics. Saladin is running everything now, from the wells to the walls to the war councils. And Cairo knows it. The tricky part? Egypt is officially Shiite, and Saladin is very much not. Most leaders might panic, or purge, or throw the theological equivalent of a tantrum. Saladin? He listens. He waits. He prays. Then he invites both Sunni and Shiite scholars to dinner. He feeds them warm lentils, pours sweet rose water, and suggests, gently, that maybe they could agree on a shared set of charitable goals first. You know, while they're still debating finer points of succession from centuries ago, it's diplomacy by soup, and weirdly, it works. You begin to notice the Friday prayers shift, just a little. The caliph's name is mentioned slightly less. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, Sunni, is referenced slightly more. It's not sudden. It's not loud. But it's happening. The prayer rugs don't rebel. The streets don't riot. The people of Cairo mostly just shrug and say, well, at least the bread's fresh again. Because Saladin's vision isn't about banners. It's about stability. That he maintains Fatimid rituals longer than he has to. Keeps their scholars on payroll. But when the old caliph finally dies, Saladin does not replace him with a Fatimid heir. He quietly declares loyalty to the Sunni Abbasid Caliph instead. No riots. No fire. Just a peaceful pivot. That's the word for it. Pivot. Not a purge, not a revolution. A realignment, so gentle you hardly notice the ground has shifted beneath your feet until the new flags are already flying. And in that shift, Egypt changes, from a religious monarchy ruled by old dynasties and sharper swords to something new. A calmer, leaner administration. A unifying thread between Cairo, Damascus, and eventually, Jerusalem. You watch him in his study one night, quill in hand, scratching out a letter. It begins. We will not win by conquest. We must win by coherence. He pauses, taps the ink dry, then starts drafting army budgets on the back, because yes, he's still planning for war, but he knows something most leaders don't. You can't hold a city if you never held its people. And in Cairo, even the children selling dates on the corner know his name. Not because it's printed on gold, because he repaired their roof. Section 7. Egypt doesn't rise like a lion. It stretches, slowly, like a sun-warmed cat, steady, restored, and strangely unbothered by the storms brewing beyond its borders. It's been years since Saladin took power, and Cairo has forgotten how fragile it once felt. Markets hum. Grain moves. Soldiers practice formations without yelling. Even the tax collectors have started using polite words. And now, Saladin is leaving. You stand beside him on the docks of Alexandria, wind pulling at his robe like it's trying to talk him out of it. But he's already decided. Syria needs him. More accurately, Damascus, his ancestral home, is in the middle of a chaotic estate dispute, and the estate in question happens to be half the Levant. Saladin boards the ship with little ceremony. Just a well-wrapped travel kettle and a worn map of river crossings. Behind him follows an army not of conquest, but of cohesion. Former Fatimid officers, Kurdish lancers, Arab archers, even a few stray scholars who want to see what war looks like when run by someone who takes notes. Syria is not ready for him. You arrive in Damascus to find a web of rival princes. Tax evaders, mercenaries with very flexible loyalties, and one man claiming to be descended from a Persian prophet if you'll just let him borrow your cavalry. Saladin doesn't scold. He just starts sorting. He meets with governors, listens to complaints, and with barely raised voice, persuades entire cities to stop bickering and maybe join a broader vision. One with less looting and more water wells. Some say it's charm. Others say it's the clean books and paid soldiers. You say, it's the tea. He offers tea at every negotiation. Within a year, Damascus is his. Then Aleppo. Then Hama. One by one, the cities of Syria align under his rule, not because he takes them by force, but because he's the only one not demanding a bribe. He doesn't rename streets or melt old coins. He doesn't build giant statues. In fact, he still travels light, sleeps on mats, eats what his men eat. A spy once reports back to Jerusalem. He owns no palace. His army trusts him. His scribe is exhausted. Back in Cairo, they still send him letters asking if he'll come back. He writes back kindly, promising stability will hold, because Egypt, now, doesn't need him, but Syria. Syria is starting to believe, not in his army, not in his titles. I in him. And that's when you hear it. A whisper across the sand. Jerusalem. A Crusader king has taken up arms again. Knights from Europe are riding under blood-red banners. The kingdom of Jerusalem has grown bold, rich, and increasingly reckless. Saladin doesn't panic. He doesn't rage. He just calls a meeting, draws a line through a dusty map, and says, softly, we'll need more water wagons this time. Because this won't be a battle. This will be a reckoning, and unlike everyone else at the table, he's not here for revenge. He's here for balance. Section 8. The sun at Hattin is not a kind sun. It presses down like a second war, slow and relentless, turning every helmet into a tiny oven and every breath into dust. You're with Saladin now, standing on a low ridge above a wide, yellow plain, watching the army of the kingdom of Jerusalem gather below. Their armor shines. Their banners flutter. They chant prayers and ready spears. Saladin? He adjusts his turban and drinks water slowly. He's waited years for this. This isn't revenge. It's response. A measured reply to decades of raiding, of civilians caught in siege lines, of pilgrims and merchants alike trampled beneath horse hoofs. You've heard the stories, how the Crusader king Guy de Lusignan marched his men out in midsummer, across dry plains, chasing a battle they thought they'd win by brute faith. Saladin didn't stop them. He waited. He cut off their wells that he let the heat speak first. You watch from a quiet tent the night before the battle. Saladin doesn't roar speeches. He reviews water rations. Sends his nephew with orders to secure a ridge. Then, in the dark, he prays, not for blood, for clarity. Morning comes like a hammer. The Crusaders are tired. Thirsty. Confused as Saladin's men. Rested. Lightly armored. Moving in arcs like dancers who trained in silence that he doesn't charge. He coils. Small units harass the flanks. Archers pin the enemy into tighter, hotter spaces. A single brush fire, started accidentally, sends smoke rolling across the battlefield like a blindfold. And when the moment comes, it's not thunder, it's closure. The Crusader lines break. Knights fall. Horses bolt. The relic of the true cross, their sacred banner, is taken. King Guy is captured. So is Reynold de Chatillon, a man whose career has been built on cruelty. He once vowed to march on Mecca. He once slaughtered unarmed pilgrims. Saladin meets him in person and, with calm eyes, offers him water at a gesture of truce. Of mercy, Reynold drinks. Then Saladin takes the cup from his hands and, very quietly, says, "That drink did not come from me." And then, well, Reynold doesn't leave the tent. The rest are treated differently. Guy is fed, given shade, eventually returned to his people, because Saladin doesn't need theatrics, that he needs the war to end. The field at Hattin is quiet by dusk. Smoke curling, armor cooling, birds returning. You sit with him at the ridge again. He's not smiling, he's watching the horizon, because Hattin was never the final goal. Jerusalem still waits, and Saladin isn't marching toward it in anger. He's walking there with purpose. Section 9. Jerusalem is not quiet. It hasn't been for decades. Not since the First Crusade carved through its stone walls like a hot knife through date paste, leaving blood in every alley and a city sacred to three religions teetering on the edge of permanent trauma. But now, it's waiting. You arrive just behind Saladin, not as a conqueror, not yet. Just as a presence, a patient, measured, sand-colored tide that has already reshaped Egypt and Syria and left Hattin's battlefield cooled under a blanket of strategy and silence. Inside the city, panic stirs. The Crusader garrison knows what happened the last time someone captured Jerusalem. They remember the stories. They remember what their forebears did. They assume Saladin will do the same. He doesn't. He sends a letter, a simple message, delivered politely, proposing surrender. In return, safety. The Crusaders hesitate. Negotiate. Stall. Saladin waits. You watch from a ridge as he moves his camp closer, deliberately, without urgency. He tightens the noose not with rage, but with rationing. Trade routes close. Wells dry. Rumors leak. Finally, the city offers terms. Saladin agrees. Jerusalem surrenders. And then, nothing burns. No churches are looted. No blood flows in the gutters. No children are dragged from homes. Instead, Saladin walks into the city on foot, unarmed. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is left untouched. The Dome of the Rock is carefully restored. The people are allowed to ransom themselves, not by violence, but with time and dignity. He even gives gold from his own treasury to help poor families who can't afford the fee. One Crusader widow weeps and begs for mercy. Saladin gives it, not because he's soft, but because he understands that a city is not made of walls. It's made of people. He stations guards at holy sites to protect them, from both looters and overzealous liberators. He walks the Via Dolorosa at dusk, alone, hands behind his back, eyes lowered, not in triumph, but in thought. This was never about conquest. It was about balance. The Crusader nobility are escorted out, safely, many on horses provided by Saladin himself, and as they leave, they speak not of defeat, they speak of him, the man who took the holiest city in Christendom and treated it like a shared inheritance, not a trophy. That night, you sit with him in a quiet courtyard beneath olive trees. He drinks tea, always tea, and reads a letter from a Christian monk who wants to return to the city, not to fight, but to study. Saladin smiles, folds the letter. Let him come, he says. Learning needs no passport. The moon is full, and for the first time in a long time, Jerusalem sleeps. Section 10. If you were writing a fairy tale, this would be the end. The quiet man reclaims a holy city, offers mercy instead of fire, and walks home under an olive sky with the world's respect tucked neatly in his robe. But this isn't a fairy tale. It's history. And history doesn't pause for applause. Not even for Saladin. Because across the sea, on wet hills and stone roads far from the smell of cardamom and sandstone, the crowned heads of Europe are very, very upset. Enter the Third Crusade. You've probably heard the names. Richard the Lionheart, King of England, fond of charging into battle shirtless and writing slightly emotional letters. Philip Augustus of France, more diplomatic, less dramatic. Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, who tragically drowns before making it to shore. They come not as pilgrims, but as armies. The Holy Land is once again a chessboard. Saladin sees it coming. He doesn't flinch. He writes letters, reorganizes supply lines, strengthens coastal fortresses, and perhaps most importantly, keeps sending scouts with very clear instructions. Don't panic. Just pay attention. The Crusaders land. And Richard, oh, Richard, he's everything the songs promise. Brave, cunning, fond of charging straight through formations with a big sword and a bigger ego. But he's also complex, educated, deeply Catholic, and, inconveniently, sort of fascinated by Saladin. They never meet in person. That's important. They exchange letters, gifts, and, in one particularly odd moment, a snowball packed in ice delivered by camel. No, really. Richard is wounded? Saladin sends his personal doctor. Richard's horse dies in battle? Saladin sends 2 new ones. Fine horses, 2. It's war, but not hatred. They fight, and fight hard. The siege of Acre, the battle of Arsuf. Cities change hands. Maps redraw. And through it all, Saladin remains steady. He never taunts, never gloats. He praises Richard's bravery in public. Even offers to help negotiate between squabbling crusader leaders when they threaten to ruin their own campaign with internal drama. The people notice. So do the crusaders. Whispers begin. He's a better Christian than our kings, someone mutters in a French camp. It's half a joke, and half not. Saladin doesn't win every battle. That's not his goal. His goal is simple. Jerusalem stays safe. And it does. Richard advances, then stops. Realizes that taking the city would be symbolic, but impossible to hold. Supplies are stretched. Morale is uneven. The crusade begins to crack under its own ambition. And so, the 2 greatest generals of their age do something very unromantic. They talk. Through letters, envoys, careful phrases and courteous metaphors, and in 1192, they agree, a truce. Jerusalem remains under Muslim control. Christian pilgrims can enter freely. The war, for now, will rest. Richard boards a ship and sails home quietly. Saladin returns to Damascus, tired, thinner, but somehow lighter, because he didn't win with fire. He won by enduring. By outlasting. By being the kind of leader who sends fruit baskets to his enemies and insists the battle ends when it stops making sense. Not when the other side is dead. You sit beside him in a garden the next evening. There are no parades, no medals, just jasmine in the air, and the soft sound of pages turning as he reads poetry by lantern light. Section 11. You'd think peace would bring quiet. But peace, it turns out, is noisy in its own way. There are treaties to honor, borders to patrol, letters to answer. And somehow, a merchant in Tripoli has sent Saladin a very large falcon that refuses to eat unless spoken to in Greek. He's back in Damascus now, not as a conqueror returning from glory, but as a tired man with sand still in his boots and a to-do list that seems to grow faster than armies ever did. The city greets him not with trumpet blasts, but with whispers of respect. Shopkeepers speak his name like a blessing. Street children mimic his walk, robes trailing, pretending to debate tax policy. Even his enemies, those still alive, admit, often begrudgingly, that he is the reason the Holy Land hasn't burned again. He's still governing. But it feels different now. There are fewer battles, more decisions. Fewer urgent messengers, more scholars at the door. The court is filled not with generals, but with city planners, physicians, and poets. You watch him spend an hour comparing irrigation maps, then break for tea with a Sufi mystic who tells him that the soul, too, has walls that must be rebuilt after siege. He nods, makes a note. Sometimes you think he's still in motion, like a caravan that forgot to stop moving. He visits hospitals, inspects schools, funds a university with the spoils of war, not to boast, but because he promised, once, to leave the world better. But his health is fading. He walks slower, sleeps less. The tea gets stronger, the letters longer. He begins to speak more of faith, of impermanence, of how cities fall and rise and fall again, not because of armies, but because of how leaders forget to care about small things. One evening, alone in the courtyard, he watches children play with a broken wooden sword. You hear him murmur, "I built armies, but I hope I built peace too." The air smells like oranges. The moon is waning. He has no crown, no golden robe, just calloused fingers and worn sandals. And still, the letters come from Sicily, from France, from scholars he's never met and rulers he once opposed. They ask for advice, for blessing, for guidance on how to govern without cruelty. He answers most of them, usually in the morning, after prayer, always with a fountain pen that leaks a little at the tip, because even now, even after truce, after triumph, after years of desert sun and saddle sweat, Saladin is still, somehow, writing the end of this story by hand. Section 12. There's a certain stillness in the air now, the kind that comes after long marches and long arguments, a hush that wraps around Damascus like the soft edge of sleep after a storm. Saladin is slower these days, yes, but his mind is still miles ahead of most people in the room. He can listen to two governors argue about water rights and, 5 minutes later, hand them both a solution scribbled on the back of a poetry scroll. He doesn't want more land. He wants smoother roads. He doesn't crave statues. He wants fairer contracts. You travel with him now not to battle, but to borders, places where peace needs to be held up like a leaning wall. You cross the Beeka Valley. You visit garrison towns where soldiers still stand at attention when they see his banner, even though he insists they sit and drink first. One of his commanders calls him the most polite threat in history. Saladin just smiles. He's still in correspondence with Europe. Yes, even Richard. The truce might be signed, but the conversation continues. They exchange gifts, weather reports, philosophical questions. There's even a rumor, likely exaggerated, that Richard once proposed his sister marry Saladin's brother, so the Holy Land could be shared. It didn't happen, but the idea lingered, because that's the kind of leader Saladin was. He made war feel like something that might eventually give way to a shared table. He doesn't speak often in court anymore, but when he does, everyone leans in. He tells stories from his youth, laughs about his first failed attempt at tax reform, wonders aloud why cities always forget their bridges until it rains, and quietly, always quietly, he continues to give to schools, to hospitals, to mosques and churches both. One day, you ask him why. He replies without looking up from a donation ledger, "Because I want the poor to remember justice, not war." There are no monuments with his face, but if you look closely, you see him in the aqueducts that still flow, in the roads that still hold, in the libraries where children now read without fear, because victory, to Saladin, was never about banners on a wall. It was about whether the people beneath those banners slept in safety, and that, he would tell you, was the real campaign. Section 13. The end doesn't come all at once. It tiptoes. Saladin, once the man who walked through desert campaigns without flinching, who kept 3 regions breathing under one gentle hand, now takes the stairs with care. His gait is measured, his voice softer, but his presence still fills every corner of Damascus like a favorite poem that everyone's memorized by heart. He no longer leads armies. He leads meetings, quiet ones, with maps spread across cushions and advisors who now think more in terms of harvests than hostilities. There are no more sieges to plan, no more fortresses to reclaim, just cities to repair, fields to drain, students to fund. And so, he spends his final months doing exactly what most warriors never get the chance to do. He builds. You visit a town by the Orontes River, newly fitted with clean wells. A school in Homs where girls now read beside boys. A hospital in Jerusalem where both Christian and Muslim physicians work side by side, and where the only requirement is clean hands and kindness that he signs land grants, reviews food prices, checks on flood control. Everywhere he goes, people gather, not to cheer, but to nod, to touch the hem of his robe, to ask questions, not for favors, and Saladin answers, until one day, he can't that it starts with a fever, not dramatic, just inconvenient. He insists it will pass, continues meetings from bed, dictates notes with a weak voice, still tries to approve one last irrigation proposal while coughing between lines. But the fever lingers, the physicians frown, and eventually, he stops fighting it that he asks for one thing, a simple prayer rug. And there, in a quiet room filled with light, surrounded by scrolls and the faint scent of orange blossom, Saladin lets go to no gold, no crowned, no pile of trophies. When his treasurer opens the estate ledger, they find almost nothing. A single coin, a few old books, a horse that's more loyal than valuable, and a note, unfinished, that reads, "All this, for a world I could not keep." He doesn't leave monuments, but the people weep. Christians mourn him in Acre. Jews light lamps in Jerusalem. Muslims pray in mosques from Cairo to Mosul. Because when a man spends his life uniting instead of dividing, he doesn't need marble that he lives in memory. You sit beneath a fig tree that evening. In the city he made steady, the wind is soft, and though the world keeps turning for a moment, it turns a little more gently. Section 14. You'd expect the world to move on quickly. Wars end, flags change, and time, as always, carries dust over everything once called important. But not this time. Saladin's name lingers. Not as a conqueror. As a compass. In the months after his passing, Damascus holds its breath. Not out of fear, out of awe. People tread a little softer. Speak his name the way they used to whisper prayers into cupped palms. His burial is simple. No gold, no parade. Just a small tomb with a wooden marker and the kind of silence that says, "This mattered." But what happens next isn't grief. It's continuation. His sons and brothers, none as steady, none as humble, try to hold the realm together. It fragments, of course. That's how power works. But the roads remain. The schools stay open. The doctors still come to work. Because Saladin didn't build an empire of palaces. He built one of expectations. Even his enemies feel the weight of his absence. European chroniclers, some of whom spend entire chapters describing Muslim leaders as devils, write about him as a man of honor. They praise his mercy, his intelligence, his humility. The word chivalry starts to mean something a little different because of him. In Cairo, a merchant passes down a story about the time Saladin refused to raise taxes during a famine. In Jerusalem, a priest still teaches about the day Saladin opened the city gates to all pilgrims, regardless of their god. In Aleppo, a mason carving new stone for a school says simply, "He would have liked this one." His face never graced coins, but children are named after him. His image doesn't fill paintings, but his ethics sneak into law codes, and in time, you realize something soft and stunning. Saladin didn't leave behind a golden age. He left behind golden behavior. A blueprint for how to rule when no one's watching. How to treat foes when you're the one with the upper hand. How to win without crushing. How to lead without shouting. And now, years later, as the world changes again, his story remains, not in monuments. In murmurs. Because true legacy isn't about being remembered loudly. It's about being remembered kindly. Section 15. History likes its heroes dramatic. Trumpets, speeches, Battles that end with flags raised and sunsets perfectly timed. Saladin had none of that. And yet, here we are. Centuries later, still whispering his name like it's a comfort. Like it's a reminder that power can be graceful. That leadership doesn't have to be loud. You walk now through the cities he once held, Aleppo, Cairo, Jerusalem. The walls have changed. The markets hum with new songs. But somewhere, under all that, his fingerprints remain. A public fountain still feeds water to the poor. A hospital still carries his name on a plaque worn smooth by centuries of hands. A street in Damascus still turns toward the house where he once paused to fix a leaky roof before addressing his generals. Because that's who he was. The man who remembered roofs. Not just victories. The man who, even at the height of his military glory, asked whether the tax records were up to date and if the poor had grain for winter. He didn't unify the Muslim world forever. But for a while, he gave it breathing room. He didn't conquer all of Christendom. But he won the respect of those who'd marched to destroy him. He didn't leave gold behind. He left a story. One that tells you mercy is stronger than rage. That justice outlives fear. That maybe, just maybe, the best leaders are the ones who choose quiet when they could have chosen thunder. And now, as the city sleeps, you feel that same hush settle over you. Like a soft blanket of old sand and old wisdom. You remember how he refused to wear silk. How he prayed at dawn no matter the weather. How he offered his enemy water before asking for surrender. And in the silence, you understand something. Saladin didn't win because he was stronger. He won because he was gentler. And that, somehow, was harder. So now, you're drifting. The map has faded. The battles have stilled. There's no more dust on your sandals, no clanking armor or calls to prayer echoing from stone minarets. Just a soft, endless quiet, and the feeling of a breeze that might be centuries old. You followed a life that spanned deserts and diplomacy, war and restraint, politics and prayer. A life full of movement, but somehow never in haste. Saladin wasn't perfect. No one in history is. But he was steady, principled, and yes, unexpected. He ruled with clarity instead of cruelty, with stillness instead of spectacle. He walked into holy cities not to tear them down, but to let them breathe again. And when the weight of it all grew too much, he didn't clutch power harder. He let it return to the people. So tonight, as you close your eyes, remember this. Kindness can be strategic. Gentleness can be firm. And mercy, offered at the right moment, can shape more than any sword. You're safe now, wrapped in centuries of silence. Let the old world fade into stars. Let the names and dates float away like parchment and wind. There are no more decisions to make. No more letters to write. Just the memory of a man who could have ruled through fear and chose grace instead. Sleep well. End of script. Sweet dreams.